From the Enquirer and Cincinnati.com, I'm Amber Hunt, and this is a live episode of Accused, the unsolved murder of Beth Andes. When we released our last episode, we really did think it was probably our last episode. We admitted we were hopeful that we'd get to record an episode 9, but we weren't holding our breath. The goal was to solve the case, and that meant that maybe one day we would have to record an update saying, hey, guess what? Some key person has come forward, and it's time we put a bow on this investigation. Some key people have, in fact, come forward, and we'll share some of those conversations tonight. But real crime solving is too far removed from Perry Mason for that to mean much. So we've still been digging, and we've been passing along interesting finds to police. But we are, for some reason, not in a position to request search warrants or issue subpoenas, so there's only so much we can do on our end with the things that we uncover. Still, we are here recording episode 9, which is crazy. The podcast did so well that we've really been inundated with questions via email, Facebook, Twitter, all kinds of places, asking for updates, and so that's what we'll do today. Because this is live, we're going to structure this a little differently, but you'll notice some similarities too. We're also going to ask that you tolerate the difference in recording quality, because we are not in a fancy dead room, but in a hardwood floor window storefront in a neighborhood in Cincinnati called Over the Rhine. It's a great place for, gathering and eating food, but maybe I guess we'll see how good it is for radio recording. I just promise we won't make a habit of it. So thanks to listeners being so amazing at spreading the word, the first 8 episodes have had an astounding 4 million listens to date, unless SoundCloud is lying, which we don't think it is. But we don't want this to be too self-congratulatory because it's not about us. It's never been about us. The case has come to mean more to us than we can really articulate. But this is about Elizabeth, or as her friends always say, it's Beth. It's always been Beth. So to that end, I'm really thankful for everybody out there who cared to listen. If nothing more happens with the case, I know that this has meant a lot to her family. This is a woman that they love so much and they miss, and they're grateful that her name is known, if nothing else. But meanwhile, Amanda and I still work, so we'll start tonight by bringing you up to date. Right as episode 8 was airing, a friend of Beth's named Jane Lemon reached out to me on Twitter. She lives on the East Coast now and was 2 years younger than Beth. A few quotes from her were included in the print version of the story about Beth that ran on Cincinnati.com. You're welcome to find that on the series landing page if you want. But because we were finished recording, she wasn't included in the actual podcast. Our first conversation, she said she stumbled on us completely by chance.
As I said in my note to you, for years I've been on the internet. I tried to subscribe to the Plain, articles from the archives of Plain Dealer, from the Enquirer. I can't believe there's nothing on this. I couldn't find anything. So one night, just literally a week and a half ago, I'm sitting there at 10 o'clock. I'm like, oh, what the hell? I'll just try again. And there you were. I'm like, holy smokes. So I kind of immersed myself in what you've been doing, and I'm freaking out listening to Hallie and Sue, and I haven't been in touch with them for years, but just listening to this, because it was so horrible. And anyway.
If you remember, Beth had lived in a rented house in Oxford on Ardmore Street. Amanda and I have driven there, and it was within easy walking distance of Beth's job at the Red Ox, that half deli, half drive-through beer joint where she worked with her friend Hallie and her manager, Robert Buzz Call. He's the one who told police he spent more than 2 hours with Beth at her new apartment the night before she died, but none of her friends had heard about this until we told them this year. Jane was intimately familiar with the Ardmore house. In fact, she lived there, moving in right after Beth and Sue Parmalee moved out. The idea was that Beth and Sue couldn't sign another year-long lease when they had another semester of college left, so they bailed and moved to the Candlewood Terrace apartments, which offered a short-term lease, and that was about 0.6 of a mile away. But the kids who moved into Ardmore weren't completely strangers. They actually all went to the same parties, hung out with the same circles, that sort of thing. And in fact, one of the women who lived there with Beth and Sue was a full year younger, so she signed on for another year there. And Jane, who was a year younger still, took one of the other rooms that had freed up. Beth was so close with the new crew living at Ardmore, in fact, that she was even storing some of her belongings there as she emptied her apartment and ready to move to Cincinnati, where she was planning to start working at a department store. Jane remembered another thing, too. Beth had free reign to use the phone there after her own phone at Candlewood Terrace was disconnected for the move. She remembers this very well because after Beth died, after Jane returned from Christmas break, having already attended Beth's funeral, she found a note from Beth on the kitchen counter.
Anyway, when I got back and then the horrible thing happened, and oh my God. And then after the holidays, I got back to school. I remember it was really snowy, and I went into the house in Ardmore. Sarah had graduated that December, so she didn't come back with me, so I was by myself. I got into the house, and on the counter in the kitchen was a note from Beth, and she said, "Hey, Jane, hope you had a nice holiday. Thanks for," remembering it was a short note. "Thanks for letting me store my stuff here. I made some long-distance phone calls. Here's $5. And I had already been to her funeral. So that kind of freaked me out.
Right.
You know, at the time, you know, I was so young, but at the time, I remember thinking at the time, just, I don't know why, just maybe because I lived at the Ardmore house, the police would come and ask me something. But again, I guess maybe that would have been stupid. And at the time, maybe I should have called the police and said, "Here's this note." And of course, I didn't. But I remember it like it was yesterday because, you know, obviously that's the kind of stuff you remember.
Did you keep the note, do you know?
Of course not. No, I really didn't. I know you were going to ask me that.
No, I don't pass judgment on this stuff. I know it's been a long time, and it's not like it was connected to a pleasant memory.
So it seems as though someone at least told police about this note because there is mention of it in the police files. And this note, having read about it, it's always kind of bugged me because it indicates that Beth used the Ardmore phone in the days before she died, which makes something in Buzz Call's report seem a little bizarre. Quick reminder, Call filed a written report with police the day after the murder and told them he'd been in Beth's apartment with her, watching a movie as she packed on Wednesday night, the night before she died. And then 3.5 hours after writing that report, Call reached back out to police to add to his statement. This time, he said Beth had also been to his house Wednesday night. The report says he'd left her Candlewood Terrace apartment and gone home, and about 10 to 15 minutes later, meaning sometime between 11:30 and midnight, Beth showed up at his place to make a collect call to her parents. He said her first attempt didn't go through, so she hung out for maybe 10 minutes and then tried again before going home. There's no further detail in the statement. This stood out to Jane, who also worked at the Red Ox with Beth and Call and didn't know them to be friends. What she did know, however, was that Beth had access to the Ardmore house and used the phone there regularly. So it struck her as odd that she would have gone to Buzz Call's house, which was about the same distance away in the opposite direction as Ardmore, to use his phone instead.
The part about him going to her apartment the night before, which to me was very weird, and listening to Hallie and Sue, I was shocked that they weren't more shocked. I was shocked. Because it just didn't seem like it would be her to do that at all. And then she goes over to his house afterwards because she wanted to make a long-distance phone call. And I'm thinking, well, you know, maybe, I know she had a car, and clearly she had access to a telephone in my house. I mean, she left me a note and used the phone and left me money for a long-distance phone call. So it wasn't like she didn't have a place.
Would she still doing that at midnight, though? Let's say, is there some reason, was there anybody staying there that she wouldn't have wanted to disturb at midnight?
No, there was nobody in the house over the holidays, and she had a car.
House.
It was an empty house, but I can't imagine, quite frankly, at the time, I can't imagine her anybody being afraid to go in the house.
The day after this phone call, Jane called me back.
Hey, anyway, the thing I wanted to clarify, I was thinking about it again last night. When I was talking about why would Beth have gone, you know, Buzz said that she came to his house later after they visited.
Right.
To use the telephone, and it was late. You said, wasn't it like 11:45 or something like that?
Right.
Anyway, and your producer asked me, because I said, why would she go there if she's already been using the phone in my house? And then you asked me, well, because it was late, would she have felt uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Because the house was empty. And I really thought long and hard about that again last night, and my answer's the same. But to clarify, as I said, she had a car. She was really comfortable in the house. That was her house before it was my house.
Right.
So for her to be uncomfortable even till late at night, to me, doesn't make sense. And that I think she would have been, since she, obviously she used the phone because she left me a note. She paid for, long phone calls, which was silly, but it was, really sweet. I just don't, to answer your question, no, I really emphatically don't think she would have been uncomfortable. And my only other point on that one is, unless, this maybe obviously is a question to her family, and you probably already asked it, but, I think back when I was in college, just, unless it was emergency, I would be calling my parents at midnight.
I know, yeah. And they have said
point.
that. They don't remember getting the call, and they said it would not have been typical for her to call that late anyway. How would she get into the Ardmore house, by the way? Did she have a key, or was the door open?
Yeah, I gave her a key. And
you gave her a key?
She would have come in the front door.
Granted, Jane's memories from the time aren't crystal clear. It was, after all, many years ago. But she said some elements stand out to her as though it all happened yesterday, and there's a reason. Jane had never known anyone to die before, making Beth's murder not just tragic, but also a sort of coming-of-age experience for her.
So that morning, the phone rings, and my mother, I was in an upstairs hallway with a phone carol kind of thing. Back in the old days, you only had one phone per floor. And I remember my mother coming into my room saying that Billy, who was my boyfriend at the time, he was like my Cleveland connection with those guys. She said, Billy's on the phone. And I said, I'll call him back. I don't want to get up. And she finally came back in. She said, he really wants to talk to you. He said it's important. So I got up, and I remember being a little annoyed. So I got on the phone, and I remember where I was sitting, and he said, Jane, Beth Andes is dead. And I said, what do you mean Beth Andes is dead? He said, she was murdered. This is hard to think about.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And I remember, and it's okay. And then I remember just being shocked. Then we go to her funeral. I can remember what I wore. So weird. At that point in my life, Amber, nobody had died. I didn't lost some grandparents. I mean, that was like the first for me.
Right.
And I had this really delayed reaction. I remember at the time thinking, well, I should be more upset. So we go to the funeral, and I don't remember, it was a funeral home, I guess. And everybody goes in to sit down, and I freaking lost it. I mean, big time. Like, where I had to be removed.
Do you remember after the acquittal, were there people talking about, well, then who did this? Or was it just like trying to get through it and keeping our heads down?
Yeah, it was more like that, Amber. I mean, unfortunately for your information, but I don't remember people talking about it. I do remember, though, quite frankly, I do remember all of us at the time, we were very young, too, but it was like, no way did Bob do this. No way. No way. And then later I came to change my mind on that for no reason. I mean, with no data, but thinking, maybe because I watched too much IDTV, but, it's like that's the most logical choice. But, I'm now, and that actually until I started listening to your thing, that's what I thought. But now that I'm listening to your thing and I'm thinking, well, the thing that got me with Bob is the confession, but I know that confessions can be coerced, so, but.
So over this time, you kind of convinced yourself, well, it must have been him?
Well, to me, that just made sense to me, just based on, how most of those kinds of murders happen.
Sure.
That's generally, it's somebody very close, but obviously not always. And he was acquitted, and he was acquitted in the civil trial. So, and I keep thinking, but one thing I do remember thinking at the time, and again, this is just my opinion, has no basis in fact, was that the police screwed up somewhere along the line.
Jane suggested we track down an old friend of hers named Lee Rickard, with whom she hadn't spoken in years. Lee also worked at the Red Ox, and it was there that he learned what happened to Beth from a female coworker whose name he couldn't even remember. He also struggled to remember the boss's name, though he was able to describe him physically, on the short side and with dark hair.
Does the name Buzz Call ring a bell?
Yes, that's exactly right. Buzz, he was the overall manager.
Do you remember your impressions of him?
What do I want to say? I mean, he wasn't a friend. I don't know if he had anybody that was his friend there, really. He was a little bit of a bossy boss, you know. And like I said, like I remember was he was kind of short, and I don't know if he, you know, was compensating for that. But he was just kind of, like I said, I don't remember him as being a friend in any way, shape, or form. But in the same respect, I don't remember him necessarily being an ass either.
Okay.
But he was, Buzz, that's right. Who told you that one, Jane?
No, actually, so one of the reasons his name comes up is because in the police report, he filled one out that said that the night before Beth died, he had spent about 2.5 hours at her apartment with her and nobody else. And so I'm trying to just sort of piece together whether people knew that they were friendly in that way or not.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't tell you. I really don't remember that at all.
Do you remember anybody talking about how the boss there had been with her the night before she was killed?
No, I don't. I do not remember that. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't hear that. It's just I have to be perfectly honest. I just don't remember.
Yeah,
but I do. You know, little things are coming back. So it did happen in her apartment, didn't it?
It did.
Yes, and she was stabbed like 20 times or something like that.
20 exactly. Yeah.
20 exactly.
Yeah, and then strangled as well. They're thinking she was strangled first and then stabbed during or as she was dying.
That's bringing back some horrible memories.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, don't apologize.
I mean, it's not, it's not a pleasant thing to talk about. I'm just trying to figure out if anybody remembers much more about Buzz specifically.
No, like I said, all I can remember was, like I said, he wasn't a friend, and I don't remember me wanting to befriend him necessarily. He was just kind of a bossy boss is the way I'd put it.
Okay.
But I do not remember he and she, I really don't remember them being friends at all, but I just don't remember.
One of the things that kind of bugs me, and it doesn't mean that there's anything to it, but just if you don't mind humoring me a second,
sure.
is that nobody seems to have heard about him hanging out there the night before, and I'm trying to get my head around whether that's typical. I mean, none of this is typical, but just the idea that nobody, did people just not talk to each other at this job? I mean, did they not relate personal stuff? Because that was a pretty big story. Yeah,
and you know what? You're probably right. I would bet for a good week or more, or maybe even months with the trial and everything, we probably talked about it a lot. But unfortunately, I have to be honest with you, I just don't remember.
Yeah.
I just don't remember at all.
Jane's not the only person connected with the case who's reached out. We also heard from a man named Ed Boggs. He lived at the Candlewood Terrace Apartments and, in fact, remembers the night a frantic young man pounded on his door, asking if he'd heard gunshots and demanding to use his phone. I tried during our initial reporting to reach people who'd been in that apartment, and I managed to talk to one. Jim Gattermeyer was his name, and he was Ed Boggs' roommate for a spell. I didn't include Gattermeyer in the original podcast because, despite remembering Candlewood and some other details from his Miami days, he said he had no idea what I was talking about when I mentioned the police report he'd filled out describing someone using his phone to report a murder. Anyway, I mention him now because that's the Jim that Boggs is referring to in this clip.
We were sitting around listening to music, and it was pretty loud, and Jim heard, he said, "Is there somebody at the door?" And he turned down the music and said, "Is there somebody at the door?" And when he opened the door, this guy was looking pretty frantic and everything, and he said, and I'm surprised I can remember a lot of this stuff, but he said, "Did anybody hear shots? My baby's been killed." That's what he said to us. And we were like, huh? You know, we didn't know what was going on. And he said, can I use your phone? And then he used the phone, and we were all sitting there kind of, what is going on here, you know? And we heard part of what he was saying on the phone, and we were like, huh? And afterwards, he ran down the steps, and Jim and I walked down there too.
Asked him if he could describe Bob's demeanor for me.
To me, he acted more like someone that had found somebody. And apparently he had knocked on a bunch of doors and nobody would answer the door.
Yeah.
Because he was, I mean, from what he said, the apartment that he lived in was at the end of the apartment complex, and then it went into like kind of an L shape. And we were after the L, after the corner. So, you know, we were kind of far away from, not too far, but, you know, he had apparently knocked on a couple other doors. And he was, to me, he was just frantic. And, you know, as far as if he had done something, you know, maybe he was just, they had a lot of adrenaline, but, you know, he did have a lot of adrenaline and all that kind of stuff in him, because when he opened the door, he kind of startled us, you know, the way he came in and yelled. And actually, when he initially yelled, you know, did anybody hear a shot and all that stuff, actually that's when Jim walked over and turned down the music. I remember it was when the Blues Brothers came out, and we were listening to the Blues Brothers album. But
that's right.
And so and we were like, what? You know, what'd you say? And he said, do you have a phone? And we said, yeah, sure. And we gave him the phone. And he called, and he kind of, he was kind of almost like crying or whatever. He was having a hard time getting it out and everything. I don't remember what he said or anything like that, but, you know, and that's when the seriousness kind of hit us, like, what is going on here, you know? And Rick got kind of freaked out. He was like, what, you know, what's going on? And I think he because it was, you know, 9:30 or whatever. And the only reason I remember that is because I saw it in the paper. But you know, he lived over across from where Kroger's used to be in those apartments. I don't remember what they were, but he just got his stuff and left, you know, and because he was kind of freaked out by it.
Wow. Okay.
So we didn't know what to do, you know. We just, like I said, we went down and sat in the lawn, and, you know, because we didn't know what to do either, you know.
Police didn't take statements from the three roommates that night, Buck said. Instead, 2 officers showed up back at the apartment about a week later.
We actually were partying pretty good when there were probably about 20 of us up there the night that the police came to us, because it was like 9 o'clock at night, and there was a knock at the door, so I opened the door and said, come on in, and there was 2 Oxford policemen standing there, and smoke kind of blew out the hallway, and everybody's like, oh, crap, you know? and then they just said, well, we need to talk to Ed Boggs. Oh, great, what the, you know? And I went out there, and they said, we need you to come down and talk to us, and blah, 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 you know. So I guess they were pretty friendly towards harmless fun, you know. So
This reminds me of something that I did notice, though. So your written statement was like a good week after the death. Had you left? Is there a reason there was so much time in between? Like, why wasn't your written statement
you know,
the next day?
We were kind of like, we all kind of wondered, I wonder why the police haven't called us, you know, because they just never did. And it seemed like, and I don't, and this is just, you know, a memory from a long time ago, seemed like it was, you know, somebody kind of went to them and said, hey, you know, aren't you going to ask these people? Or something like that, because we were like, you know, why didn't they ask us? And you know, and Rick and I and Jim were kind of like, you know, I wonder why they didn't call us, you know. But we never did understand what was going on with that.
Now, if you remember in previous episodes, we talked about a guy named Boyd Glasscock. He's the one who reportedly gave Bob this strange gift of a pincushion, one that Bob remembers as being drizzled in red like blood, and who said he was in love with Bob and that Bob loved him. Well, Ed Boggs hadn't listened to the podcast when we talked. He'd just heard about it from friends and relatives and found my phone number to see if I wanted his input. When we talked, he brought up Glasscock on his own.
Did anybody ever tell you about the weirdo that came to our house?
Yes. Please tell me
No.
about him, though, yourself. Yeah, I would really. That
some
is
guy
one of
came
those
there,
cases, yeah.
and he was. I could never figure out if he was just some kind of had mental issues or what it was about him or whatever. But he came, and there were me and I think my cousin was there who lived with us, and another guy that was a friend of ours. We're sitting around, and this guy came, and I don't know how he even got in our apartment. He knocked on the door, and I don't know how he got in the apartment. But we're all standing around and everything, and he started talking about all kinds of weird stuff. And we noticed that he was obviously gay, or at least he acted like it. And he started talking about all this weird stuff that he thought that what was the guy's name? Robert Young, that he was reincarnated. He was the ballet dancer Nijinsky, the Russian ballet dancer Nijinsky reincarnated. And at that point, we were kind of like, huh? You know, we couldn't figure out what he was talking about. And then somebody, of course, we were all young and everything, and somebody said something about incest or something like that. And you know, because at this point, the one guy that was there, who was a friend of another cousin of mine, who was kind of an ignorant guy, whatever, he was just talking about how, you know, he loved incest and all this. And we were like, what? You know, what's going on here? And the guy goes, oh, yeah, me too. Our family practices it all the time and all this kind of stuff. And at this point, we were trying to back him out the door because we had no idea who he was. And he was he was saying who he thought killed, and I don't remember who he said, but who killed the young lady and all this kind of stuff. And like I say, at this point, we were just like, dude, you got to leave, you know. So
you don't
we
remember
never did.
what his theory was?
No, I don't remember. But it almost was like he was trying to say that, because, oh, that's right, he was saying that Robert Young was his boyfriend. And it almost sounded like he was talking about, you know, that someone had done it. Well, I don't want to guess at what it was because it was just so long ago. But we got really weirded out by this guy and just wanted to get rid of him, you know, at this point. And we did report it to the police.
That's how I know about it.
Yeah.
So this visit for me is one of the pieces I really had hoped to find a little more about. Can you describe, like, how he looked, anything that you remember?
I mean, all I can remember is kind of a shadow of what he wasn't. He was probably 5'8" or maybe like 5'6" to 5'10", something like that, and he was a pretty ordinary looking guy. You know, I mean, he fit in up there in Oxford with the kind of, at the time, the preppy look, you know, and he wasn't dressed. He was just dressed, you know, ordinarily and all that kind of stuff. I actually forget who else was there other than my cousin, but really nothing out of the ordinary. We just thought he was someone that was trying to get attention from everything that had happened and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, it being as serious as it was, that was why we reported it to the police.
If he seemed involved?
Yeah, after, I mean, he was so creepy and so weird that we just, we wondered why he came there, what he had to do with it, and all that kind of stuff. And that's the main reason why we reported him, because we also didn't want him coming back, because we hadn't, he didn't scare us, but he just creeped us out really bad. So, we never did figure out what was going on with that.
Unfortunately, Glasscock died in 1995, so who knows if we'll ever get closer to figuring out much about that visit. All we know is that while family members say he was never violent, he did struggle with mental illness and behaved in a way that has some people familiar with the case wondering whether he had something to do with the attack, maybe motivated by a desire to get her out of the way so he could have Bob. We don't know. So this is largely where things stand. It's been 2 months since the last episode aired, and while we've reached a lot of people, we still need to reach more if we're going to solve this, so we'll keep at it as long as we have to. If anyone wants to reach us, you can email us at accused@enquirer.com or find us online. We have a new URL, so feel free to find us at accusedpodcast.com. We're still online at Cincinnati.com as well. We have Facebook pages and a Twitter account. All of this is to sort of compensate for the fact that she's still not listed on the cold case lists in Ohio or Butler County. I wish I could put more of an exclamation point on this so that it feels more done, but it just doesn't work out that way. So the next time you're watching one of the TV cop shows and they're wrapping up in an hour, just imagine me sitting next to you screaming at the TV, because that's not how real life works. And also, that is what I do when I'm watching cop shows at home. I don't know if we'll ever be able to say the work on the case is done, but I do promise that as new information arises, we'll do our best to update the millions of people who've invested time and emotion into the story. We figure we owe her that much. The rest of this episode is a Q&A with audience members who joined us December 14 at Graydon on Main and over the Rhine. We've included it here for anyone who might be interested or have similar questions, though we did realize afterward that we should have had at least some of the people introduce themselves for the benefit of the listening audience. That's on us. To make it a bit easier to follow, we'll edit in a few introductions after the fact for players who helped make Accused possible. The first question, in fact, comes from Joanne Schreiner, who works alongside lawyer Debbie Leiden, the Andes family's pro bono attorney. Schreiner handled some of the very first records requests for the Andes family.
Can I actually ask two questions?
For you, yes.
Thank you. The first question is, I'm curious if anyone who was in that apartment, and I realize that you can't ask Boyd Glasscock this question, but how would he have shown up at that particular apartment? Does anybody know what brought him there, or what's your speculation?
There were newspaper reports at the time that said that Bob had to go to a neighbor's apartment, and it's our understanding that he had gone around asking neighbors which apartment it was. So he just basically canvassed until he found the right place.
Thank you. And the second question is, why isn't this on the cold case list? Can it be any colder? And what are they waiting for to put this on the cold case list? And what would happen if it did get onto that list?
I mean, really, putting it there would be more symbolic than anything, and it would give people who were looking for it. Like, one of the things about Jane Lemon that stood out to me was that she said, every few years I go online and I look for this case. How do I know that somebody with actual information about this case isn't doing the same thing, and they've had nowhere to go over the past, 4 decades? So that's really the point for us to have it listed. It's the prosecuting attorney and the police that basically lobby the attorney generals to put it on the state list. They keep telling us, in terms of the current investigators with Oxford Police, we've been told that it'll go on, but it never, I can't imagine being the family, because we've only been doing this for a little more than a year, and we've been told the same thing 15 times. So imagine being them when it's just been again and again and again. But in Butler County, I understand it's because they don't consider it unsolved, and they just as far as I know, they still don't, because the prosecuting attorney, who is still in charge there, was part of this case.
I wanted to thank you guys so much. It's such
thank
a
you.
wonderful, wonderful adventure to ride with you. My question is, you had mentioned at the beginning how doing a podcast gave you freedom from strict journalism. So in that spirit of freedom, from all the information you do have, she knows what I'm going to ask. What's your theory?
So we still followed all the journalism rules, though, actually. we let you see behind the curtain. But the truth is that these interviews would have taken the same tone and it would have been the same if I'd just been writing a story versus you hearing the interview. Like, that all would have been the same. That said, I will absolutely, happily go on record saying that everybody who is alive that we've talked about and talked to, please interview them. Like, they still have a pulse. Go talk to them while you can. There's no reason not to. If I had the power to make that happen, I would, because I think even if it's not one of these people, somebody more trained in forensic interrogation might be able to glean some info from those interviews that maybe I wasn't able to glean. We do have theories. We're not going to pretend that we don't. And I'm not one of the journalists who subscribes to the idea of, I don't think it's possible to be totally objective. So you embrace your subjectivity and you fight to be fair. That's really important to me. But at the same time, every time we've started to go toward a theory in our heads, we always remember that the people who started this investigation did that and wouldn't let it go. And we don't want to put the same blinders on. Because I wasn't there, I don't know. It could be that I'm missing a tiny or huge key piece of info that would change everything. So I just refuse to let myself get too attached to anything.
It does help that so many people that we've talked to along the way have different theories as well.
In case you forgot her voice, that's producer Amanda Rossman speaking. Yeah, that's true, because every time we do get kind of excited about an idea, somebody else goes, nope. It was so.
But what about this?
Yeah.
I could go on all night with questions. I love this. I've listened to it. I'm on my third time.
Oh, thank you. Wow.
And I was at Miami at the same time, but I did not know her. Although those pictures look just like me and my friends.
Right.
Anyway, I wanted you to talk about the calls from the Ardmore house, which you did, and that cleared up a few things. My burning question is, do you really think Buzz was at her apartment the night before?
I would be happy to, I don't know, what do you guys think?
No. Hell no.
It bothers me that nobody who knew her says that makes sense. Now, could it have been that she did something out of the ordinary because she'd been spooked by her door being unlocked when she got home from Christmas break? Possibly. But the thing, there was one person who emailed me that he made a really good point. He said he has 2 daughters, and once somebody goes in the you kind of creep me out zone, you don't put them back in the come help me because my door was unlocked zone. So that, of course, me not totally feeling comfortable with that idea doesn't mean that he did anything. It's just I don't necessarily believe that he was there that night.
I think I remember that somewhere along the line, someone else you interviewed, and maybe 5 or 6, said that Detective Baird and Buzz were good friends. And that seemed to surprise you. And it's like, I really find that odd.
It did surprise me. Nobody had mentioned it up until then. It hadn't even been broached.
Right. We couldn't confirm that they were friends during 1978, 1979, but we do know they were friends along the way.
Well, my next question.
So she's just going to move in. Okay, one more question.
Okay. Well, do I ask you about, doesn't Bob now think, does he realize the significance of this dirty pincushion or bloody or whatever it was? That's so weird.
He does think it's very weird, and and he's torn because one part of you is like, oh gosh, I wish he had held on to it. It would have been, but let's say it had been drizzled in blood, and he had
somehow
handed that
ended
over
up
to
with
police,
a bloody
then
pin
he would
cushion.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm a little torn on whether that would have been for his benefit or not to have held on to it. So.
Hi. First off, thanks for doing this podcast. You guys did a great job, and so
Thank you.
appreciate it. So I have a couple of questions about your method. So it seems like every episode was scripted. Is that correct?
You pretty much just saw it,
Yeah.
except less giggling because I messed something up and less swearing when I messed something up.
So my question for you guys then is, when you were crafting this script, knowing that it would be audio and not written, how did your understanding of narrative and language change?
It helped that I had worked for the Associated Press as a news editor for a bit, because when you work for AP, every story you start, you're nodding, every story you start begins as a brief for broadcast. So I was familiar, obviously, with writing in present tense and trying to keep it conversational. It still took a lot of trial and error, though. We did at least 5 drafts of
Our first
episode
episode
1.
had probably 5 drafts, and the portion of the first episode came from us going back and forth.
Yeah, so we would just go back and forth, and eventually we started to feel like we found the right tone for this. And I actually remember at some point, I think the first draft was too clinical, and I didn't insert, us into it. And it's not like I like being part of it, but because we were the first to look at the case, it became clear that it would actually sound weird if we didn't acknowledge our role in it. So at one point, when we were going back and forth on the first, I just remember telling Amy and Amanda, I was like, I kind of had an epiphany last night. I think I know how I want to do it. And then I just wrote it. And from there, we were good.
My experience with what we call pre-publication review, which is reading stories before they're printed to identify potential legal issues or potential liability. But I really found it was important to I had the script, but I really felt like I had to listen to it.
Speaking here is Jack Greiner, the Enquirer's lawyer who first heard about the case from Debbie Leiden.
Because I was just concerned about just nuances and emphasis and that sort of thing. There's a lot of, the interesting piece of this from my perspective was, the potential, I suppose, for somebody to say, well, you've implied that I did this. And, there can be what's called libel by implication. And so it was, and probably any number of people mentioned in the thing could at least raise that issue. I mean, Glasscock was dead, so we didn't have to worry so much about him in terms of being a libel plaintiff. But, certainly Buzz Call and the maintenance guy, Steve Green, so trying to, for Amber and Amanda to present the story in a way that made it interesting, and yet, just be careful about it or just think about it. It was interesting because I really felt like I had to listen to it rather than just read the script. And then I sort of felt guilty, like, I can't believe I'm getting paid to listen to this. I did, but.
I want to add that while it looked sort of effortless on episode 9, we really learned along the way.
This is Amy Wilson speaking. She served as the Enquirer's editor for Accused.
I think what's important is that this was a new avenue for all of us, and we sort of really learned a lot, and we really tried a lot of things, and I think we experimented with a lot of different tones and whatnot. And I think at the end of the day, Amber and Amanda figured it out themselves. I think we did go through. We laugh about episode 1 having a lot more versions than the other ones did because we tried so hard to make sure that you all would be hooked by episode 1 and that you would want to listen to episode 2. So we actually did take pains to make sure that we had the right tone.
And just to be clear, not for clickbait reasons or because we wanted you to care about Beth's story.
Yes, we did.
And I'm really glad that I dropped the Cockney accent that I was going to do. I think that was a good choice.
Well,
yeah,
I kind of insisted.
Yeah.
Another question about your method, or I guess behind the scenes stuff. Producing this extended and long form podcast cannot be cheap. What can you guys say in terms of, because like everybody's like, okay, how's journalism going to continue in this era of digital, et cetera, et cetera? How can a project like this be funded? How did it work for you guys? What can you tell me about that without,
Let me begin by saying that Amber and Amanda are not cheap. Much to the.
Yeah, Peter, our editor, is probably more. I will say, just before he starts, I will say that for me, I realized that this was a really great way to do it because we had the backing of a newsroom that already had finances. If we had tried to do this on our own, we wouldn't have. Yeah, I mean, we traveled to 3 states. We shared hotel rooms. We're real tight now, but it still costs money, obviously, to do that stuff. So I'm really hopeful that there will be other newsrooms that follow suit because I think we are best suited for this. But I don't know about the money beyond that because I'm intentionally
And the other thing we should say is that Peter basically and the organization basically said to us, as long as we kept digging and we kept finding things, we could keep going. And that's tremendous latitude. Thanks, Peter, for that. I just had to sort of make regular trips into the editor's office and say, you know what, maybe not this month. And so we just had to keep moving along this, he said, just keep going, which essentially is what we're continuing to do, is to keep going.
The Peter being referenced is Peter Bhatia. He's the executive editor for the Enquirer.
How would you answer a money question?
Actually, I have no idea. Because I didn't care. As they got into the reporting and as I was getting the regular reports, and then when we got to the point where the drafts were starting to come in and, I hear the music from Accused in my head when I'm asleep because as they worked through it, I listened to every installment multiple times and offered my own feedback to it as well because it was so clearly such an extraordinary journalistic work that I wasn't going to let anything get in the way of it. We did have some fairly significant expenses associated with it, particularly because we did the recording at CET, right, and employed an engineer there to help us with it because we didn't have the wherewithal within our own staff to do it. One of the outcomes of this is I just had a capital expense approved to have a studio, they're these small sort of little sound booths, basically. They're about the size of a telephone booth, if you remember those. And a person or two can go in them and record in a acoustically good environment. So we just had a capital request approved to buy one of those so that for Chapter 2 and other podcasts going forward, we'll have that capability in-house. So, I'm from the school of if the content is good enough, we'll find the money. And that's really what we did in this case.
Speaking of the music, where'd the music come from? And how do you add those layers of detail onto something like this as the production goes forward?
The music came from local musician Andrew Higley.
Hi, Andrew.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have musicians in my family. My uncle is actually a professional musician in California. She's got a nephew,
a cousin who dabbles in.
We reached out to them and we told them about the project, and then they did some drafts of stuff, and it didn't quite fit. And my uncle was like, "Yeah, I don't really want to go back and forth." So we're like, "Oh, if we're going to do this, we've got to actually pay somebody." Who knew? And then we found Andrew, and he was completely on board. It was so much fun because I played violin when I was in elementary and high school, through high school for 8 years. I played violin, so I knew a little bit what I was hoping for. So I could say things like, I like a lot of crescendo, and I like it to be driving. And so he gave us a draft for the theme, and then I said, "Yeah, but it still needs the hook, something people are gonna hum." And so we just went back and forth, and then we had an interesting experience trying to make sure that we didn't editorialize certain parts of it, because we wanted the music to help drive the story. And I also was scared to death that people would hate my voice. So underneath me, you hear more music. But we were very careful in not putting music under certain interviews so that we couldn't be accused of trying to manufacture your response to those interviews. So that was one of the fun parts for me.
Right. And sorry, thank you for your patience, but can you update us a little bit? We heard a little bit about the VDOC Society and its involvement and how it works, and you talked to some of those folks. Anything new there? Are they still involved? Are they working on anything?
There's a different cold case society that's helping now. I did talk to Lieutenant Jeff Robinson this week from the Oxford Police Department. He does say that they are still working on the case. I haven't seen much, and we're not going to be told a whole lot about what's going on. But we're assured that something's happening. I don't know how long it's going to take, and I wish I could answer that better, but I can't.
Amber, the reason I'm here is because I sent you a letter some time ago. You didn't respond. I tried to call you a number of times.
Okay.
You had not responded. I left you messages. You have not responded. My question goes in a totally different direction, which is very simple, that I read your section in full, which is about 45 minutes, which I give you credit for because I can read the Enquirer in 3 minutes. So at least it gave me something to read. And as detective stories go, I've read hundreds of them. I've written them over the years. I'm a former reporter. It was good, but there was no resolution. You really didn't have any point toward the end of it. It was a whole 16-page section, which is my main argument with Peter. He and I have discussed this before.
Do you have a question?
Oh, sure I do.
How about we get to it?
I'll get to it, which is basically why is the Enquirer spending in this inordinate budget that Peter just talked about that kind of money to report a 16-page section when you're missing the news in Cincinnati? You guys are covering Pike County. You're covering, I'm not done.
No, you are. I do remember getting an email. I do. But I'm not going to respond really well to somebody saying, why did you waste your time writing this story? Because I've talked to her family and her friends, and they have been in tears, being so grateful that we still cared. And I do care, and I'm not going to apologize for caring. So I appreciate that you think we should be spending our time some other way. I think we do a damn good job covering Cincinnati, and I'm very proud of the work that I've done here. And I know that it's meant a lot to her family. So that's okay if you didn't want to read it. You're welcome to pass that story by, and you don't have to listen to the podcast. But this actually gave my life meaning. Doing this made me feel really good about being alive right now. So I'm not going to apologize for that. Yes, ma'am. That's okay. Oh, I'm glad you're here. That's fine.
Thanks a lot. And I'm sorry, I have to respond to that. My son was a homicide case, and it went for 7 years. And I would have paid $1 million to have this kind of coverage.
I wish I could do it for more cases.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing is I started a nonprofit group just to get the families out there on the streets to find out what had happened to their kids with cold cases. Because you don't get a lot of coverage with this stuff.
No.
It gets so.
Because what we do is, as a profession, we'll cover the event when it happens. And then so often when the leads dry up, we have to walk away because we don't have the staffing. This is an anomaly. This is crazy that we were allowed to do this. And I'm so grateful that I was able to do it. I started covering crime in Detroit. I covered it for about 8 years. I covered a lot of cold cases there. And the way that it rips apart human beings, how they can't recover, how it changes, how a woman down the street who didn't even know the kid raises her own children. The ripple effects are never ending. So if I can help one case, I'm pretty happy with being able to do that.
Yeah, I'm just grateful for that because it has to get out.
I'm sorry you went through that.
Yeah, it has to get out. You have to market it. You have to let people know what's going on. That's what newspapers are for.
I mean, I think it raises bigger issues beyond the Beth Andes story, which is very, compelling and interesting. But I mean, I think the idea of a coerced confession. Right over at UC Law School, there's the Ohio Innocence Project, and they deal with, they didn't get involved here because there was an acquittal. So this would not be the type of thing. But, they deal with coerced confessions frequently, and people who get convicted and then they're exonerated by DNA evidence. So I think that's an issue that has resonance beyond this particular case. I think how prosecutors, come to conclusions and sort of make their decision and then engage in confirmation bias that leads to a conviction has resonance beyond this case. I think that there's many issues, and again, just your story, ma'am, just how a family reacts. I mean, this is what, 38 years later, and this family, is still looking for answers, and there's just this emotional connection there that makes for very interesting content. And again, you can't tell every story, but if you can tell a story as well as this story was told, you hit on a lot of points that live on and that continue on. And so I think it has a lot of meaning, just from my perspective. I'm biased, but.
Okay. I think we also felt as if the people who were in charge of this case 37 years ago are still in charge in Butler County. And I think it's completely fair to ask people to do their jobs. It's what it's part of the mandate that we have as watchdogs. And I think in some ways we live in a society or we live in a pop culture that we get 1 hour resolution of things. And I think that the world is much more complicated than that. And I think that there is nothing wrong with presenting stories that have no resolution, because some stories don't have resolution. We're in the truth business. This is truth. This is what truth looks like.
Jack, I recall part of the story indicating that you were influenced by Matt Crehan as far as either finishing law school or going law school. And I think Amber said this is a good story. So
Said
if you don't mind, would you mind talking about it?
So I was a junior at Miami that year, and I was a political science major, and that was at a time in my life where I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do. I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to play center field for the Reds, but I wasn't good enough. So beyond that, I needed to start making some decisions, and. So the murder happened December 28th on break. And some people have asked, well, was everybody talking about it on campus? And no, honestly, I think that, and I've thought about that, I think the fact that it happened over Christmas break, had some influence. I think the fact that it happened to Beth, who had, her class had graduated the May before. So her contemporaries mostly were gone. And frankly, even the people who stuck around for an extra semester were gone. And, the cops said they had the guy. So it wasn't like there was a sense that there was a murderer, running around. So anyway, murder happens in December, and the trial happened, you would know, right? In March, right? In March of 1979. Now that I'm a lawyer, that just astounds me. I mean, that is a nanosecond in terms of how the justice system works. But in any event, so Matt Crehan was the defense lawyer, and you heard him on the podcast. He's a kind of a short guy, very self-confident, very self-assured. He had sort of a New York City accent because he was from New York. Sounded a lot like Al McGuire, if you remember Al McGuire that used to do the basketball games. And so like in April, he comes to a political science class of mine, really just to do a career day. I think he had already agreed to do it, so it was a very innocuous kind of career day. But somebody asks about the trial, and we knew generally about, the Miami Student did report the paper. That's the Miami Student's a paper at Miami. But anyway, so there was some reporting, so we kind of knew about it. But somebody asked him about the trial, and he started talking about it. And one thing led to another, and he pretty much gave his closing argument. And I can tell you, he said, let me tell you about Bob Young. I won't try to imitate his accent, but he's like, let me tell you about Bob Young. Every time somebody came in to talk with us about the case, anytime it was one of his friends, one of his relatives, Bob Young stood up and hugged him. And let me tell you, huggers aren't killers. And that's how he kind of ended it. And I walked out of class like, I'm going to law school, because that's the coolest thing ever. And he became a judge later on in Butler County, and I wound up having in fact, I had an Enquirer case in front of him, and I told him the story. It was just, but so when this came up, and Deb Leiden was a lawyer working with the Andes family, she called me because she had some public records issues she wanted to talk about. And it was like, can you come over and talk about helping this family whose daughter, or their daughter's sister was murdered, and we're having some public records issues with the Butler County prosecutor. And I was kind of like, well, I've had public records issues with the Butler County prosecutor. So anyway, I went over, and that's all I knew. And then she starts telling me about and I'm like, it's that case? Are you kidding me? And so that's a small world.
I was actually wondering, so when you have a case and a story that is as expansive and vast as this is, with so many moving parts and all of the factors that you have to consider, how did you condense it and make it make sense in episode form? Like, tell a story with an arc during one episode, but also maintain the big picture. Because I know it's difficult, even just in a written story, to get everything together. But when you have all of the sound effects and everything else, plus trying to make it engaging for a listener, how do you do that?
It's called magic.
So it helped that I've written true crime books, because I approach this basically the same as I would. And it, in truth, this was way better research than any of my books. So, this was free. Don't buy my books, I guess is what I'm saying. No, but so I treated each episode as a chapter, and when you get to a chapter end, you kind of want to have a feel of an ending, but a cliffhanger. And so we just really kind of used my previous experience to try and figure out how to translate it into podcast form. When I start to research a case, I'll start with the trial transcripts, and I color code everything. So if I find a line that I think is worth noting, I'll give it a color. Like if it's specific to the suspect, it might be blue, victim might be pink, the day of the murder, details might be orange. And then I used that color coding in we call it a war room. It's just a little tiny office. So the first chapters, episodes that I mapped out, we had 6. And so I would transfer over, okay, there's going to be some yellow in here and some orange and some pink. And then that way, when I flip back through the documents that I had highlighted, I could see, okay, this would make sense here. And it also helped me to keep from repeating things, because there's yellow here and there's yellow over there. So it was very labor intensive, and the start of it was very slow because it was just a lot of reading and highlighting and trying to really understand the case.
We began by putting Beth's picture in the war room, so she greeted us every day. And secondly, they created these podcasts. These categories. So basically, we divided it into the crime, the victim, those sorts of things, and then again, who was Bob, and then if not Bob, who. So essentially, some of the organization that you see in the episodes was in fact organization that came to these 2 women very early on as to how to sort of talk about the individual. We had, in terms of ability to make it understandable, we had to make you understand who the people were and what had occurred. And so essentially, you can't just hop right in. You have to sort of lay it out sort of slowly. And obviously this is what they're paid the large dollars for.
Yeah, and you have to approach it with an idea of how to make all of this manageable, because, the trick of doing any project is actually finishing, and you can't finish it if you don't figure out how to make it manageable. That was really important from the beginning.
In a similar craft sort of way. What prior podcasts did you take inspiration from, since true crime is seeming to explode in the podcast world?
Well, I had already heard Serial, and actually we made a point not to re-listen once we realized we were doing a podcast, because we didn't want to, have too much influence there. So we actually we did listen to a couple other ones done by newspapers. There was one in New York called Finding Tammy Jo. There was one out of Atlanta called Breakdown. And one in, I want to say it was Colorado. And honestly, like for us, while they all have their strengths, we also picked up on things that we didn't love. So we figured out some things we didn't want to emulate, like the one girl who went so fast. And so that was Amanda's job. I was like, make sure, because I'm sure she didn't realize she was going that fast. So it's your job to make sure that I'm slowing down. And then I listened to a lot of non-crime, because a good story is a good story. And podcasts, I wanted to understand what draws people to podcasts, period. So I listened to a whole lot of How Did This Get Made? Yeah, like an absurd amount. And I've seen so many bad movies, so many, because that's what the podcast is about, bad movies.
Yeah, This American Life is my favorite. But
yeah.
But we also listen to a lot of bad ones.
Yeah.
Podcasts.
But we won't name those.
Yeah, just in the process.
Like Night of the Living. Just kidding. They're here.
They're here.
No, big fans. For our shout out to fellow Cincinnati podcasters. You're welcome.
Amber, talking movies and Glasscock, did you find out about any artistic interests in him? Speaking of movies, we know that Halloween and Looking for Mr. Goodbar came out within about 18 months or less of the Beth Andes tragedy. Do you think there's any influence there?
Actually, Looking for Mr. Goodbar played a role in Bob's confession. And it really was kind of interesting, because when he was confessing to the crime, he described to the interrogator, well, I'm having flashbacks. It's like Looking for Mr. Goodbar. So I watched that movie, which I do not recommend. It's not a bad movie. It just was really unpleasant. That scene in particular was holy. No, I do not need to see that again. So yeah, from what I can tell, that was just kind of bouncing around his head, and he was delirious and tired at that point, so he was merging stuff. As far as Glasscock goes, I don't know. I know that he was artistic. I know he liked to paint. He would give people artsy gifts. I wish that somebody, like, we've had other people come forward whose conversations I didn't share for various reasons. I still haven't heard from anybody who knew Glasscock personally, and I would love to. I hope to hear from somebody like that.
Recently, there's a documentary out about sexual assaults on college campuses and some of the lengths that the colleges go to kind of divest themselves from what's happened and separate their entity from the incident. Did you experience any pushback from Oxford, Miami University?
Happily, no. No, Miami actually was pretty cooperative, right? But this wasn't a gray area. For them, it was off campus. They didn't handle the investigation. As far as their letterhead isn't on any of the investigative files that I've got. So as far as I know, they didn't have a hand in it. And when we needed something like, when we went and checked records there, they were cooperative. Mm-hmm. So we luckily didn't run into that. I know that that's an issue, but we didn't have to deal with that.
Do you know some of the other dorms that Beth lived in?
Oh, goodness. There was one...
Tappan Hall?
Tappan, yeah. I would have to look up the ones beyond that, though, but I remember that one because we went by there. And it was new at the time and was fancy.
I think that might have
something.
been the only dorm she lived in. And then she went into the Ardmore house and then the apartments.
Right. All right.
Okay.
Well, I would like to tell you guys that there's going to be a season 2. So we're going to do another case. Thank you. Some people are happy about it. And we're going to, this meant a lot to me journalistically. It meant a lot to me personally. So we are actually adopting a few different cases, and we're going to see which one pans out first. But we're going to keep digging.
But that also gives us an avenue to keep going down Beth's case So if more things pop up, we have a way to tell people.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.